This is the second part of lecture 5, where, as I said before, we're going to move from parallel forms into different estimates of reliability. So we're going to begin with test-retest reliability. It is important for you to read these notes. So I want you to realize that these are cursory reviews of the notes, but please do read them because I'm skipping a lot of material that's already contained in these notes. So we begin with test-retest reliability. Now imagine that we have a situation where I want to estimate how enthusiastic or how much you enjoy statistics. And I create an instrument where I ask you on a 4-point scale or 5-point scale, 0, do not, all the way to 4, extremely. And I ask you to compare statistics to other topics. So you can see here that I have human reproduction and mate selection, finger painting, potable fluid toxicology, instrumental and vocal tonal fusion, music, calculus, chemistry, physics, art, biology, and psychology. And what I would ask you to do is and then fill in the blank, do not, slightly, moderately, moderately, or to extremely, extremely prefer the selected topic, statistics, over the other. Okay, so you would be grading this. Now, this is not a great instrument, but it's one that I want you to think about because it's about preference. Okay, so I would administer this instrument to a group of people to get an estimate for preference to statistics. And in semesters in the past, I created a form where people filled it out, but I found that it's fine just to read these things and kind of imagine where you would lie. And then the next thing I would do is I would wait a period of time, a period where I would not expect your preference to change a whole lot. So that is, your true score change your true score should not change over this period of time. And then I would re-administer the instrument, and I would compute the reliability simply by taking the sum score or some sort of scoring method, and I would calculate the correlation between the two scores at time 1 and time 2. And that estimate is considered to be test-retest reliability. Now, why is it that we would expect that? Well, we expect the true score to be the same. And therefore, if the true score doesn't change, we also expect there to be the similar error variance. So therefore, the observed scores should, or ought to, be highly correlated. So the correlation between these two scores is actually a reliability coefficient. Okay, it's already squared, believe it or not, because they are parallel forms, or they're assumed to be. And that's what we're testing. We're testing in test-retest reliability whether the forms can be viewed as parallel, in that even though the items remain the same, we are concerned with whether the true score changes or not. And if we've administered it during a period of time when the true score shouldn't change, and there's little reactivity to the items, so the questions that we ask, if we ask these questions about, let's say, physics, and everybody has a particularly easy physics exam where they do well and they feel great about physics, and now they prefer physics to statistics, whereas before they didn't, that will change the score. And what we're introducing there is a systematic bias. However, that systematic bias will not be reflected in the correlation, because the correlation just takes into consideration whether you're high at the beginning or you high at the end. So one single item is not going to change a whole lot. But if all of the items change, or you have a bad stats exam and you really now feel quite disturbed about statistics as a field, you may change completely. So where you might have been much higher and enthusiastic about statistics before for administration 1, now you are a 0, you don't like statistics at all. Well, that would affect the reliability, the test-retest reliability. Now, similar to that, if we have alternative forms, and alternative forms are essentially like the example I gave in before about ETS. ETS has alternative forms, and the reason why they have alternative forms is that they really want to make sure that people don't cheat. And one way to cheat is to have the same questions come up over and over again, where they can be passed on to somebody else at that time or passed on later to another test taker. So by limiting the exposure of the questions, you can calculate alternative forms. And I mentioned in class forms A and form B for the trails. So trails form A, trails form B are very simple tasks, and they're simple tasks that have two separate forms so that people don't get accustomed to the actual form, and they are considered also to be parallel forms. So alternative forms, we hope that we can give different forms of certain tests to eliminate stress or reactivity or fatigue or familiarity, learning effects, and all of that. And the ideal is to test for and be able to have some form of confirmation that alternative forms produce parallel, give strong inference toward parallel forms. Parallel forms is the ideal. Alternative forms are slightly lower. Okay, now, moving on, a critical assumption in classical test theory is that all items are randomly selected from a population of all possible items. And one way that we can estimate that is by looking at the split half reliability, literally splitting our instrument into two, taking the scores and then correlating them. And ideally, one half of your instrument ought to be correlated with the other half of the instrument. Why? Because the items, the questions that we have in our instruments are randomly selected. Now, granted, when you split an instrument in half, what we end up getting is we get a smaller instrument, and that smaller instrument has the potential to be a lot more error prone. Now, given that, we also assume that by split halves reliability, that the error variance is probably fairly consistent across all of your items. And so therefore, one half of your instrument ought to correlate highly with the other half if the true score is the same and the error variance is relatively similar. So therefore, your observed scores should be relatively high. Now, splitting an instrument in half should attenuate the reliability, and there are correction formulas for this. You ought to read this and be familiar with why Spearman-Brown is relevant. Now, most of us don't do split half correlations. Instead, what we do is we take the average split half reliability estimates, and that is in the form of Cronbach's alpha. Now, what does Cronbach's alpha do? It's an estimate of reliability. A lot of people view this as the reliability of the instrument. Remember that Cronbach's alpha is merely an estimate, and it's an estimate of the subject or respondent by item interactions. So internal consistency is assessed by Cronbach's alpha, and it provides an estimate of how internally consistent our items are. Why? Because the items are randomly selected from a population of all possible items. You'll get tired of hearing me say that. But that is an essential assumption in classical test theory. So therefore, we calculate Cronbach's alpha, and Cronbach's alpha has a formula, just as you see here. And it's less important to understand the formula and more important to understand what's going on here. So what's going on is nothing more than giving us some idea about the structure and the symmetry of the variance-covariance matrix. And most important is what we want to make sure is that the internal consistency, that is the intersubstitutability of these items, is oftentimes predicated on whether the inter-item correlations, that is the correlations between your items, tends to be fairly consistent. Consistent in that if they should be all positive, because we assume that if they're all measuring or all reflecting the same true score, they all ought to be ordered in the same way, that is positively correlated. And if they're not positively correlated, what it does is it attenuates Cronbach's alpha. So these are estimates this is the way to estimate Cronbach's alpha reliability. Best that you understand this by calculating by hand. And that's one of the reasons why I had you do this. So that ends the two parts for lecture 5. We're going to continue on with psychometrics to an extent, but we're going to start tying in psychometrics and why estimates of reliability and error variance and all of that are relevant for hypothesis testing. These are two areas within statistics that are oftentimes treated as separate, but they are very much interrelated. So stay tuned for lecture 6.